Comics presents, live from Darshan Studios, Exposition with Brian Payne. Welcome to Season 3 of Exposition here on Channel Z. And I hope you subscribe and click the bell icon so that you get notified when we're doing new broadcasts. I'm going to try and do one every Sunday if I can, around this same time, 5:30, 6 o'clock, somewhere in there. And if you remember at the end of season 2, Google Hangouts went the way of the dodo. So I had to come up with a new way to do these broadcasts. And it seems that everybody's trying out StreamYards. And so we're going to give it a try and see if it works for us as well. So far, so good. Tonight's going to be a little bit of a different episode. I had been doing book reports more or less about what I'd been reading. And I just thought maybe I should talk about me a little more. Because you don't really know who Brian Payne is unless you've been following my work for a while or are a friend or family. So anyway, let's start out. I don't want to get into, that I was born in Ottumwa, Iowa, just like Radar O'Reilly. We ain't going to do the whole autobiography or biography, I should say. But let's talk about how I got into comics, since that's the focus of the show, more or less. And I didn't really read comics as a kid much. I read the Sunday Funnies, of course, and my favorites were like Dick Tracy, Dondi, Blondie. Of course, you like Peanuts, and I also liked Tumbleweeds and BC. But there was something about Dick Tracy, Dondi, and Blondie that I always liked artistically, even as a kid. Now, with Dick Tracy, I would have been reading them during the space period, with the Adventures on the Moon and Moon Maid and that era. But I really got into it later on when it was taken over by Max Allan Collins and Rick Fletcher, and they were doing it. But I read it all those times. But I remember as a kid, Dondi, the artwork by Erwin Hansen, or Hasten, I should say, uh, just intrigued me. I always liked those continuity, adventure, um, even soap opera strips like Dondi, Steve Canyon. Another one I really remember was Brenda Starr, Reporter. And I'm not sure who would have been drawing it at that time, but I remember Basil with his eye patch. And Steve Canyon, of course, by Milton Caniff. But it was something about Dondi, maybe the fact I was a kid, but I really liked that strip. And I think Erwin Hasten art was the main reason. Erwin Hasten has a long history where, he dates back to the Golden Age and drew some all-star comics and that as well before doing the strip Dondi. And then what I liked about Blondie, I have to think when I was reading Blondie that it was being drawn by Stan Drake, but I'm not sure. But the thing I really started noticing in Blondie was that the dog Daisy and Dagwood would often have the same facial expression, and it would change from panel to panel. And I always, Stan Drake is great about facial expressions. So I have to think that might have been something he did just to entertain himself. But anyway, that was I read the Sunday Funnies, of course, and the weekly comic pages. Although I'm not sure we always had a daily paper, but we definitely got the Sunday edition. So, that was something I did as a kid, but I didn't really read much uh, comics. Mad Magazine was always around. My cousin and my aunt at their house, they always had them. And I bought a couple, but I wasn't really crazy about Mad, but I appreciated it. But this is past the Harvey Kurtzman era. This is 60s, early 70s we're talking. And but I always enjoyed it. And in fact, when I first started doing comic strips, I had them typeset because of Mad Magazine. That's kind of how I thought they were done. And then in high school, a few people had Heavy Metal Magazine, and I would leaf through that and maybe even bought one. I don't know, but or was given a couple. But I remember Kaza from there, who I really liked a lot. Everybody was going crazy about Mobius, and rightly so. But Kaza, what was his stories called? Suburban Nightmare, something like that. But I really liked those. Those struck a chord with me, as did Matt Howarth. Um, he did some stories in there that were Post Brothers, I guess, but they were a little more vague than that. There was a guy named Raisin, and Enosification was one chapter I remember being. But I liked Matt that again, but it wasn't something I went crazy about. But I kept it in my mind. Um, and somewhere along the way, I came across a copy of that Origins of Marvel Comics book. And that had, like, the first edition of like Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, the Hulk. So that kind of introduced me to superhero comics. But again, I read the chapters, and I found it interesting. A guy in high school drew comics, and I remember him drawing the Wizard one day, and that really I got interested, and that might be why I was reading that Origins of Marvel Comics, or Oranges, as Resident Tump says. But anyway, that's kind of where I stood with comics. And it wasn't until I was taking a class for sign painting. This was after high school, after college. Well, I didn't go to college, but I did attend one semester at the American Academy of Art. But things didn't work out financially, so I couldn't afford to continue that. So I got into this CETA program, which was a program where the government would pay you a weekly wage to go to this school to learn a trade. And my trade was sign painting, and it was the Institute of Lettering and Design in Chicago. And I was taught by Sid Borden. And we were learning to become sign painters. Unfortunately, the class was supposed to last, what, 3 years? And it was cut after 1 year, and we were turned loose. So I never really learned to be a sign painter. I picked up a few things. We were kind of doing show cards at the end of my tenure. which are pen and ink lettering. So, I got to do a little bit of lettering, but just when it was starting to gel, Reagan cut the funding and we all were left to our own devices. So, anyway, while I was at the Institute in Lettering and Design, the secretary, Phyllis' son, was drawing a comic book and wanted someone from the school to letter it. And I said I could do that. And while lettering his comic, I kind of saw how he was drawing comics and writing comics. But he also gave me some comics so that I knew how the lettering should be done or looked in comic books. And fortunately, uh, this was in like 1982, I think. And the first comics he gave me were the last issue Frank Miller wrote of Daredevil, which was inked by Terry Austin, and one of the last two Moon Knight comics written by Doug Mensch and drawn by Bill Sienkiewicz. And that made me see what comics could do. Those two comics, I saw that, hey, comics are art. Uh, I could do this. I always wrote a little. I always drew, and I also made some movies, some 8mm movies when I was in high school. So this kind of like touched every base of that, writing, drawing, images and pictures together to tell a story. So, but again, this is 1982, and I didn't draw my first comic for almost 10 years. So, these are all the steps that were leading me up to being a comic artist. And then in 1991, I was working in and living in Wicker Park, Illinois, which is a neighborhood in Chicago. And this neighborhood was famous, made famous because Dan Klaus lived there, the 8-Ball cartoonist. Terry Laban would come into the shop I worked at with Dan, and Gary Lieb also. And they drew these little 8-page, one-sheet comics on the back of flyers while they had coffee at the coffee house across the street from the print shop I was working at the time. And they would bring these flyers over, and a few copies ran, and I would run them on the Xerox machine. And I always kept one for myself. And Gary Lieb showed me how to fold it and cut it to make the little booklet. So I started doing those after being shown how it was done by Gary Lieb and having watched Dan Klaus, Terry Laban, and Gary Lieb do these jam comics. So I started doing these little comics with one-word titles like Drag, Strip, and Blood. Blood was back then you could change the toner from black to blue and from blue to red just by changing the cartridge. It wasn't like risograph, but similar. And so I did a comic of the history of assassination in America. I had Lincoln, I had King, I had Kennedy, I had John Lennon. And then I printed all the portraits in blue. And then I took ink Indian ink with the eyedropper, and I dropped that all over a sheet of typing paper. And then I switched the ink and ran through the blue portraits and switched the ink to red. And this came out like a blood splattered mess. So I always liked blood. And I remember showing that to Dan Klaus, Terry Laban, and Gary Lieb. And Terry Laban was impressed with it at the time. Also, around this time, in this same shop, the Zoom Cranks crew were coming in from, they're like Chicago mini comic collective, kind of. Jenny Servakis, who did Strange Growths, came in, and I actually copied one of her Strange Growths 4, maybe. I forget which one. But I did one issue for her where I actually did the print run and folded and stapled it for her, and I believe. And so these were also making me see, oh, comics. And then there was a guy named Johnny Faith who also did mini comics, and he was really into Guido Serpax and kind of got me interested in that. And I started seeing comics everywhere I looked. So at this time, I was in a rock and roll band, and the band, after it self-destructed, I started drawing comic strips immediately, and it was of a rock and roll band. I basically took what I had learned in being part of an actual band and made a parody strip kind of that time in my life, and it was called Zinc Alloy and the Element of Surprise. And Zinc Alloy was the main character, and this was based in part on a European imported T-Rex record, Zinc Alloy and the Hidden Riders of Tomorrow, a Cream Cage in August, I believe it was called. And then Eddie Jobson also had a solo record called Zinc around this time or before, I'm not sure. But these two things made me use the Zinc Alloy name. And I'm still using Zinc now. Zinc Comics, as you see, is the name of the channel. So, and then right after the band broke up and I started drawing these strips, Wayne Cousy was doing Free Fest Funnies as part of Free Fest, which was a tabloid newspaper that was free in Chicago and distributed. Free Fest was a music festival every summer, and this spun out of that, I guess. And he wanted a comic section, and I remember meeting him at some coffee house or something and showing him my work, and he gave me a spot. And at that time, I was doing Zinc Alloy strips and a strip called Comic Sense, which was kind of a political cartoon. So I was doing them 2 up on a sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper. Or I was actually drawing them full size, but I would shrink them down and print them out on 2 up on a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and that's what I would submit to him. So I was getting like the upper half of a whole page with my 2 strips in Free Fest Funnies. And then after that, I ended up moving from Chicago to Sheraton, Illinois, or Sheraton, Iowa. I was living in my grandmother's house. I moved from Illinois to my grandmother's house after a bad breakup, and I immediately started doing a comic book, a full-fledged comic book. Fortunately, my cousin was a printer, and we went into his shop after hours and basically ran the first two issues of my comic, 24-page comic book, black and white with spot color. The logo I had on each issue was a color. And we ran like 1,000 in the middle of the night at bargain basement pirate prices. So while there, I did the two Lost Toys comics in 1993. And this was my first stuff. I mean, most people get used to drawing, but comics and have worked on them for a while when they were kids. I started out and everything I drew ended up in print. The mini comics, the comic strips, and these two comic books. I had a third issue of Lost Toys ready to go, but things didn't work out and we couldn't use the press anymore. So I wasn't sure how to print it. And I ended up moving from Illinois to Iowa and then on to Denver, Colorado. And while I was in Denver, I kind of put that issue aside. I didn't ink it for a long time. It was just penciled. I have a real bad problem of not finishing what I start. I mean, I love to draw it, I love to write it, but the inking is so daunting. And I always hope that I can find my Klaus Janson, my Terry Austin, my Tom Palmer, somebody who I can hand these things off to and they'll make them look great. Inking still to this day is not my strong suit. And even right now, I have what, 6 issues of a comic sitting on the shelf drawn that I'm in the middle of the first issue inking. So this is something that went on and on for quite some time. But when I was living in Colorado, I was working at a print shop once again, and I started a mini comic, classic mini comic size, and I put it out monthly for a year in, I think, 95, and it was called Fool. And I drew it on just like I did the 8.5 by 11 single sheet micro comics, but I drew this on a 11 by 17 sheet of paper. And then once I cut it, I stapled the middle. So it ended up being standard mini comic size, which is like 8.5 by 11 folded into quarters. So after Fool, I was thinking this would somehow generate interest in Lost Toys, and I could use this as a springboard to bring back Lost Toys or print Lost Toys #3. But I also, around this time, got into public access television. And I was directing and producing and sometimes starring in public access television programs for a couple years. And my big show was Hopscotch, which was a children's show. And this was on DC TV in Denver, Colorado. And anyway, basically, I kind of got out of comics. Just like before I got into comics, I was into music. I kind of got out of comics and got into public access television. And this, as long as I had one strong creative outlet, it seemed like that's where my mind focused. I'm not good at doing 2 or 3 things at once. But in 2000, I got back into comics in a big way. We were moving a lot, and we were living in an apartment in Austin, Texas in 2000 or just before 2000. And I started drawing a new comic. In fact, I had been drawing it even back in Denver, but again, not inking it. And I came up with I was doing a comic called Andy Warlock, and it was basically Doctor Strange mixed with Warhol's factory and the Warhol diaries I had been reading, and 1963, where Alan Moore, Steve Bissette, and Rick Vetch were doing basically Marvel Comics, but they were slightly off kilter. So that showed me how I could do my own Doctor Strange, who I always had an affinity for, um, and make it my own by changing it to Andy Warlock. So I had this. This was going to be my big graphic novel, I guess, even though I hate that term. And then suddenly I got sidetracked. I was going to have a character who thought he was Van Gogh. So I started reading all the Van Gogh letters. It's actually, I think, Van Gogh, but we always call him Van Gogh, and that's a hard habit to break. But anyway, the Van Gogh letters, this was going to be a part of the Andy Warlock story, but it ended up, I took it out and made it its own story, where I basically just illustrated certain passages from his letters, from Vincent's letters. And I ended up inking and drawing that before I inked the Andy Warlock stuff. And I still had a lot to draw of it. So I had the Van Gogh letters. So I started putting out digest size comics with the Van Gogh letters was the first one, Art and Life. And then I changed it to just Zinc comics, and I was going to put on a series. And I finished off the Van Gogh's letters in issue 0. And this was basically a 22-page comic stretched over 2 issues, 16-page digest. They were all 16 pages, including the covers. And I also started inking some of the Lost Toys stuff and sticking it in the back of each issue. And then the unpublished Lost Toys 3 stuff. And then I had the Andy Warlock stuff. So it became kind of a one-man anthology with a little bit of Andy Warlock, some unpublished Lost Toys 3, and whatever else I was drawing at the time. So I did 10 issues of those, I believe. Maybe no, more like 14 or 16. And there was a Jake Wilde was part of that. And then there was also I did then I moved to the Indian reservation in Chinle, Arizona, the Navajo Nation. And when I was there, I'd never had a computer until this time, 2018, I believe. I bought my first computer because we were in the middle of nowhere. And I started doing a web comic, Natty Dreadlocks and the Bear, which was kind of an autobiography of the wife and I. And I did it daily for not a whole year, but over half a year. probably 150 to 200 comics. And then I started doing one called the Arid Zone, which again was a science fiction story, but influenced by Arizona, Arid Zone. And this became my next. I started publishing this stuff on line because I wasn't working at a print shop, and one wasn't conveniently located to me where I was. So it all ended up online. And then after that, we moved around on the reservation. We lived with the Navajo, and we lived with the Hopi, and we spent some time also down by the border in a border town in New Mexico, Deming. And during this time, I was still putting out comics. This is where I did the Jake Wilde stories, which was a kind of a neo Western, modern day Western type thing, bounty hunter story. And anyway, all this came to an end when we moved here to Alaska. Although starting in Deming, I began to work on, I'd never really drawn straight up superheroes. And everyone was saying how much they hated superheroes. All the alternative comics were like, you know, I'm doing autobio, I'm not doing superheroes, you know. It seemed to be like cartoonists were like going out of their way to say it's not superheroes. And I understand that. I mean, you know, you do get tired of, you know, when you tell people you draw comics and they think you draw, you know, Dilbert, or they think you draw, you know, Batman. And there is a lot more to comics than that. But there was something about superheroes that I thought, well, if none of these guys want to do them, I'll do them. Not that there's any, you know, there's tons of people doing superheroes, but I thought, well, you know, everybody probably did their superheroes when they were 16. You know, I'll do mine now that I'm pushing 50. So I started this series called Midnight Agents. And it began as a newspaper strip because newspaper strips are where my heart is. I always will think that newspaper strips are the purest form of comic. And what I'd really like to do is a newspaper strip, but it never works out. So after I did my initial 24 strips of Midnight Agents, I decided to see what it would be like working as a comic book. So I started drawing comics, and this thing grew, and I'd put it to aside and do other things. But it always became more and more, and I'd add a few pages. I tend to draw and write in 4 to 6 page vignettes, and they kind of put together in a patchwork quilt become a whole. So I was working on this probably at the same time as Jake Wilde. And then we moved here to Alaska. And I put all that aside and started work on Cosmic Hamlet, which was intended to be a newspaper strip again. I was drawing these, unlike a daily strip, I was drawing them like a Sunday strip where it was 2 tiers, I basically just turned my 10 by 15 drawing area that I'd been doing comic books, and turned it sideways and started drawing sideways. And I worked up 12 strips and tried to get them into the newspapers. This is a small town, only about 5,000 people, and unless it's tourist season, then it becomes more like 10,000. But there's actually two newspapers here. So I thought, well, I can get in one of these newspapers. So I sent it to both of them. And the editor of the Tribune kept saying, I'm interested in this, but not during the tourist season. Talk to me later. So it kept becoming, not now, hurry up and wait. And because they were interested, I didn't really push it towards the Homer News, because I thought that I'd found a home for it if I was just patient. But needless to say, I got the runaround, and at one point they acted like I should be paying them to print my comic strip, like it was an ad or something. And no way was I going to do that. And so then I tried it again, where I drew 4 more strips, like a daily strip, not as the 2-up Sunday size format, but so it could be reduced smaller. And I tried to get it into the Homer News at that point. But the Homer News, he seemed interested, but before the guy had become the editor, I had told him the idea, and he thought it was a great idea, because he thought, like a continuity strip, people would come back every week to see what was going on. They get interested. But once he became editor, he was worried that they wouldn't become interested or remember what was in the newspaper the week before. So he wanted something shorter and more pithy and more topical, I guess, more funny. And, here I'm trying to draw Rex Morgan, MD, or something. And so that didn't work out. He told me he was going on vacation, and we could get together and talk about it when he got back. And then it was radio in communication, radio silence. So I kind of got frustrated. So I said, oh, well. And so I was going to go back to Midnight Agents. At this point, I've got, 32 times 6? What's that? Almost 200 pages worth of comics? 150 some? 120? I don't know. But I got a lot of this story, and I started working on more, started flipping things around. And the thing with comic books is they tend to grow from the middle outwards. So I wanted this to be kind of set before I started inking, because things were changing, and I was coming up with better ideas. So needless to say, I ended up with 6 6 issues worth of material, and I was going to start publishing them. Here in Alaska, every year we get something called a permanent fund dividend, which is basically they give you money that they get from the oil companies here in Alaska and distribute a check to every resident of Alaska. You get a little over $1,000, sometimes up to almost $3,000. But so I thought of this money as mad money, and I used it almost as a art grant. So the first year I published my Cosmic Hamlet strips that nobody seemed to want, in a newspaper format. I found that the printer of the local newspapers was just up the road, and that they still use camera. They still shot digital negatives. I mean, they weren't digital, they still shot negatives. So I immediately jumped on that and made a newspaper. And I distributed it for free around town here. And I was going to do that every year. I did a second issue the following year, but by then they were no longer using negatives, and that was part of the appeal to me, was that I had totally gone old school, and that this would be a perfect little series of newspapers. Plus, people acted like they were doing me a favor by letting them sit in their shops for people to pick up free. You know, I hit every coffee shop in town, the art galleries, and all that. So, anyway, after the second issue of the newspaper, I decided I would start publishing comic books again and try and get an audience outside of Alaska and hit places other than, down in the lower 48 and other than just here in Alaska. So I was getting ready to do that. And then someone came up with this idea for a shared universe of Alaskan superheroes. And in my Cosmic Hamlet strips, I had a character called the Red Mosquito. And I introduced him as kind of a comic relief in the Cosmic Hamlet strips. And he was influenced by these real life superheroes that you were seeing. There was a documentary about it, and Phoenix Jones got into some trouble. These are guys who are actually dressing up with masks and running around town fighting crime. So I thought we should have one here. So I drew. So I thought, well, I could turn the Red Mosquito into a full-fledged superhero book for this shared universe. So I gave the guy in charge my idea, and he said, that sounds great. And I said, so I should draw a 24-page comic book with the idea that you'll publish it. Yes. And he wanted it in full color. So I know a friend of mine does coloring, and I thought, well, if I could get him a little money, we could do a full color comic book. So I kind of drew it with color in mind. I did this one splash page that was meant to be the Northern Lights. And, I did a bunch of hatching and inking. So it looked pretty good in black and white. But the idea was for the colorist to have a field day with that page. Needless to say, this project fell through. And it fell through in part because I went ahead and published it on my own, because I felt like I was kind of working in my own thing, even though I was part of this shared universe. And it turned out that I got Plutoed. I'm not part of their universe, and I was realizing that. So I finally, push came to shove, and I was like, there was going to be an art show. And I was led to believe that I would have some of my pages on the wall of the gallery. Well, that show came, and obviously that wasn't true. And so once I pressed him about that, and the fact that, I thought I was going to be part of this show, I thought I was going to be part of this universe. And it turned out that, the guy's eyeballs were bigger than his stomach, and the project turned into his own thing. And I don't know how much of a shared universe it is, but needless to say, I never got a share of it. And so I took a year out of my other schedule to draw this comic book, and I ended up printing it with my PFD fund again. And so you should pick that up. It's a Red Mosquito. It's for sale at the Zinc comic shop, on Esty, Zinc comic shop. And so needless to say, that left a bad taste in my mouth. I was like, okay, I'm through collaborating. Everyone I speak to here in Alaska, they're afraid to say no or forget it. And I'd much rather be told, fuck off than put on a wild goose chase or led on to believe something that isn't true. I was also part of my Cosmic Hamlet strips were being published in another Alaskan publication, Sow's Ear, and I always wanted more than 2 in the issue, but I never got more than 2 in the issue, even though other people got more pages. And then that publication went defunct without so much as a howdy do. I found out about that through a third party. So this became kind of the running theme here in Alaska. You try to collaborate, everybody's game, but in the end, you end up with nothing. You're spinning your own wheels. So I decided, okay, I need to be self-sufficient. So now I'm back to the Midnight Agents comic book. And I'm I just finished page 14. I've now got 4 issues that are 24 pages, including the covers. And I'm thinking of publishing them with self covers so that they're more like a pamphlet than a comic book. I'm publishing them in black and white. I like black and white better than color. And, that was one thing that Matt Howarth's comics that attracted me in heavy metal. Everything else was pretty much all these bright colors and airbrushing, and his stuff was black and white, pen and ink, and it just looked great. And so there, to me, black and white is great. And I can't afford colorists, and I've got this tablet here, a Wacom tablet, that I can't seem to learn how to use. I'm trying, but it's it's taken me this long to learn how to use a pen and ink and pencil and be half-assed about it. So the idea of trying to start over and learn a whole new technology to draw with is hard for me. I willingly admit I never learned how to drive a car. So, I'm not that technologically advanced. I'm a bit of a Luddite. And so that's what I do, so I figure, these can always be published in color at some point. These comics, if I get some money or somebody else wants to publish me in color, I'm not adverse to it, but there's something about a black and white image, color just is superfluous. And I like the look of the black and white. And since I'm struggling with inking, I've been doing it slowly. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but I got 14 pages. But because of the cover, I want to show that these aren't quite comic books, but they're not uh, newspaper. They're like pamphlets or mini comics, or, I want to show that they're unique. I want to come up with something unique for these first 4 issues. And then I have 2 issues that are 32 pages that I plan to put a cover on. The cover is always heavier stock, and I never can get the slick stuff. I always end up with like a cardstock cover, and that, I never liked that in comic books, and that's one thing that I did with Red Mosquito, and that's part of the reason that I'm going to go ahead and just publish without a hardcover. Make it 24 pages with the covers, because I really, as a printer, everything was in 8-page signatures. You needed 8 pages, 16, 24, 32. And it seems weird to me to have a 24-page comic, including the covers, with only 22 pages interior, and or 20 pages interior and 4 covers. So that's why I want to keep it without a hardcover and just have it be like the guts. I don't know if any of this is making sense. I know this is kind of a hour-long ramble here, but that's what my thinking is. But then the last 2 issues are going to be 32 pages with covers, or 24 pages with covers. So there'll be 28 pages. And those I'm calling an annual and a supplement. So to differentiate from the what they call pamphlet or periodical comics. So anyway, I'm going to try and publish one a year, maybe more if I can get the money, or get inked pages inked quicker than I am at this point. And I'm also I got a Patreon account, and I lost a few Patreons, but the ones that I have, if you publish, if you pledge $5 a month, I send you a micro comic each month, but I do it on a buy-in. You get 2 every other month. So you basically get a mini comic a month, but they only come every other month. You get 2 at a time. And because of my inking and the fact that I'm not fond of it, and wish I had a Klaus Janson here, or a bullpen that I could just hand it off to and have people finish it. Where's the crusty bunkers when you need them? The crusty bunkers were a group of cartoonists that Neil Adams hung around with at Continuity Comics, and they would ink comics that needed to be done quickly all together, and they were credited as the crusty bunkers. And you could have Neil Adams inking, you could have all these people inking under that title. But anyway, I don't mind inking. It's just I know it's a weakness. So, and I'm trying to get better. Right now, I'm trying to think of what I've got as a story somebody else wrote, somebody else penciled, and I'm just hired to ink it. So I'm inking it, trying to have like a detached feeling, like, and trust that the penciler knew what he was doing. But anyway, because of this, because I don't have time to ink, I've been doing these comics in black colored pencil. And I really like, then I scan them and I really boost the contrast. And when I print them, I boost the contrast. So they look, pretty stark black and white, pretty noir. Uh, and it also captures some of the looseness of my pencils that I think my inking kind of ruins I'm so finicky with my ink lines, and uh, so they become, everybody says you're tracing after, what was that movie, Kevin Smith movie where Ben Affleck was the cartoonist. But anyway, I don't think that's what I'm doing, but it is. I'm not as comfortable or free with my inking as I am with my pencils. I've been penciling my entire life. I didn't use an ink pen for years. It was always just pencil. So using these black colored pencils has been really nice. And I might try and do some actual comics that way. But right now, I don't want to draw or write anything else. I want to finish what I got. I'm not getting no younger. So I've been putting out these Zinc comics, micro comics, called the Zinc Comics Codex. And they're basically life drawings of the same girl 3 times. And I'm exploring the relationship between a comic strip, a 3-panel comic strip, and a haiku, which has 3 lines as well. And my wife, for every year for my birthday, was giving me haikus. However old I was, she would give me that many haikus. When I was 52, I got 52 haikus. So I've been doing these haiku projects using her haikus and having draw girls uh, saying the haikus. And recently, her last set of haikus were all based on death, the ultimate wonder. It was how life is death, and you have to prepare, and very Buddhist Zen philosophy. And so I thought it was really appropriate to have life drawings combined with poems about death, haikus about death. So you had life and death, sex and death. You had it all, because I like to draw pretty girls, and that's what the Zinc Comics Codex is pretty girls drawn in with black colored pencils, reciting my wife's haikus. So this is pretty much my history as a comic artist. Uh, I've been doing it now, since 91. So, we're more than 25 years and going on to 30. Um, and I'm trying to get all these comics that I published, that I got drawn, published by uh, 2021, because that will be the 30th year I've been doing comics. But if not by 2021, 2023, that would be 30 years since I published my first comic book, Lost Toys. So I'm calling this ZN30. And if you look at the periodic table, ZN is zinc, and the atomic weight number that they have on there is 30. So ZN30 is the push to 30 and my 5-year plan. Anyway, I hope that helps you know more about me than you probably want to. and hopefully it answers some questions and makes you see similarities in your own lives. But anyway, until next time, remember, think zinc.